Okay, so in our conversations on motherhood, we're going to continue with Blushstein's article, Modern Childbirth Failure to Progress. And I want us to pick up there, thinking about this idea of why talk about the birthing process in an introduction to women's studies class, why all of this emphasis on motherhood at all in an introduction to women's studies. Is this the professor, me, just taking a really female-centric, woman-identified female approach to women's studies? Or is there something about looking at motherhood that is really important to understanding women's studies? Well, I want to take a moment with this article to really look at the way in which looking at reproduction itself from the perspective of, in particular, radical feminists has been a lens for understanding patriarchy and gender oppression in general. Radical feminists, eco-feminists, and really a lot of feminists from a wide variety of genres of feminism have really turned to reproduction and females' roles or women's roles, depending on the feminist perspective, and those roles in care or mothering as a way to understand the sex-gender system and patriarchy in general. In fact, care-focused feminists have really looked at the ways in which if we changed mothering, we might be able to change patriarchy itself. So with that said, let's jump into Blushstein and the way she looks at the medicalization of childbirth itself as evidence of patriarchy and interventions. So Blushstein is not coming out of nowhere. She has some feminist precursors that I want us to really pay close attention to, notably Adrienne Rich and Adrienne Rich's involvement in arguments that really said motherhood as a potential relationship can be very empowering for females. It can be a female-centric and woman-centric experience, and that the birthing process could be invigorating. It can be a really inspiring process itself. That sounds strange maybe to those of you that have even gone through the process, those of you who've witnessed the process, either via a video in health class or maybe first person. But nevertheless, Adrienne Rich saw this as the potential of the biological birth relationship is one that could be very pro-womanist. But she also acknowledged that the ways in which the medicalized experience of motherhood, and in particular birthing process, is one that had come to reinforce patriarchy and really had become a very androcentric form of motherhood. So motherhood being this as experienced versus as potential relationship, and really thinking about the way we need to balance medical intervention and an idea of respect for autonomy. So when is medical intervention truly necessary? And there are times when it absolutely is. Versus when are medical interventions really infringing upon the autonomy of the individual, whether we define the individual in terms of the mother, and thinking back to our surrogacy, we're going to define mother here as the gestational mother, or whether we are respecting the autonomy of the fetus in this case, because as you saw in the readings, sometimes those medical interventions are respecting neither. So in the article, Blushstein points to a few ways in which some of the modern medical interventions have really detracted from a woman-centric birthing process and really come to reinforce patriarchy. And she delineates some of these under this term active management. So she references active management as having increased under some of the policies of the ACOG, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, and their approval first of Cytotec and Pitocin, so two drugs that are often used in the during labor to increase the birthing process. This is where her title comes in, right? Failure to progress. So when labor is not happening quickly enough to speed it up. But also the ACOG's support for what's known as prophylactic elective cesareans. Now, the reason that this is important is because cesareans, C-sections as they're often called, are dangerous, more dangerous than other forms of childbirth. But also because once you have a C-section or a cesarean, as she notes, you then have to have C-sections, as is supported by the ACOG. So, as part of the standard of care protocols, you have this notion of failure to progress. So, once a woman or once a female is seen as not birthing quickly enough, and those standards have become shorter and shorter, then more and more intervention is required, blsht would use air quotes probably around that term. But also, she would note the increased use of C-sections, of cesareans. Another important thing that she points out is what she references as non-parallel risk information. So she's relying here on prior research from Wagner and Block that have noted that the amount of information given to prospective mothers, to women in labor, about the risks of either continuing on the current track or using Pitocin, using Cytotec, using other sorts of interventions, is not always parallel. And so she talks about particular buzzwords used. And then, of course, last but not least, this idea of the rise of defensive medicine. So using more interventions than necessary, and we hear a lot about this on the news, more testing rather than less. The technical aspects of all of this aside, from a social science or humanities or any other perspective, why would we be interested outside of the biology, the chemistry, the pre-med, the pharmacy? What are some of the other reasons we might be interested in this? We might want to think about these interventions philosophically, morally, ethically, as potential examples of androcentrism or as infringements on autonomy. And that's how blsht wants us to regard these. She's looking at these not from the perspective of someone analyzing the physiology, although she does point those issues out in the article. She's instead wanting to note that when we look at these collectively, that we should see a building infringement on autonomy, in which what we ultimately get is a collection of females, mothers, who are treated as if they are non-autonomous human beings, hearkening all the way back to the beginning of this semester when we talked about liberal feminism and women being thought of as irrational human beings or as non-rational, like small children. So I want us to think then that ACOG has come out strongly against midwifery. Midwifery being an option that some females use as an alternative or in conjunction with an OBGYN to have as part of their labor team when they have their own baby. If midwifery is illegal or difficult to find in some states, how might this impact mothers and their children, particularly if midwives are less likely to intervene in the way that OBGYNs are. Keeping in mind that obstetrics and gynecology, those are forms of surgery. Their interventions are different. We also might want to think about the roles that health and wealth disparities play. So, while I might prefer to have a natural childbirth and to avoid the use of Pitocin and Cytotec and all of those interventions that you all read about, I also might not be able to afford to have a private midwife. If I am receiving Medicaid, then I don't necessarily have that choice. So if there's a wealth disparity, then am I stuck having a less safe birth experience? In which case, my motherhood capacities are infringed upon doubly based on wealth disparities. So some things to think about in the way that motherhood might vary based on access to resources. All right. With that, I hope you're thinking more about motherhood and all of its different dynamics.